Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Sales Revival Conference. My name is Jerome Kisting. I'm from a company called Baobab Capital. We're an alternative investment fund manager based in Namibia, but focused on Southern Africa. Our first fund was the Baobab Growth Fund, which was a $10 million fund focused on early stage businesses and startups in Namibia. If you have any questions during the session, please drop them in the chat. And again, really sorry that I can't be with you today, but given the restrictions related to COVID, this is the best we can do for now. And with that, I'll get going. Baobab Capital was started in 2014, but we only got a mandate in 2015. And then in 2016, we really started working towards securing a lot of the deals on our pipeline and started executing those deals. And we quickly realized in 2017 the limitations of our fund size. It just meant that we couldn't participate across successive funding rounds. At the same time, the fund management company, being Baobab Capital, just doubled in size by 2018, and by 2018 we started realizing that we'd be on pace to meet some of our capital deployment targets. In 2019, by June 2019, we fully invested the fund. This was an incredible milestone for us because it essentially took us roughly 3 years to fully invest the fund. Which we were really happy about because it was one of the proofs of concept that we wanted to realize as part of the process. And in 2020, COVID hit, and a lot of our portfolio companies were really impacted. So while these startups had the equity capital made available to them, they weren't necessarily in cash flow. And as a result of COVID, a lot of orders were canceled by clients, and suppliers couldn't deliver to the portfolio companies because in Namibia, due to lockdown restrictions, the borders were closed initially, as it was in many other countries. And so as a result, we had work stoppages, and which really impacted the businesses, but also obviously impacted, and more so, the employees at our startups. I thought I'd provide a rough idea of our investment cycle, and I think this is important just to show how we do what we do, and it helps give you a little bit of context around why the impact of COVID has been so detrimental to a lot of small businesses, not only in Namibia, I'm aware, but across the world. So generally, we try to find these high cash yielding SMEs or small to medium sized enterprises or startups, if you will, with really strong growth potential. In Namibia, what we found was Namibia is a consumption economy, which just means it imports most of what it consumes. And so anytime, and this is one of the things that we found, anytime you try to get into most types of import substituting manufacturing, you actually find a high yielding startup, a high cash flow yielding startup. It takes a little bit of time to start them up, and that's where the evaluate component starts, is how long will it actually take us from putting money in, if it's a startup that is really just still at the concept stages or pre-seed stage, how long will it actually take us before this business can actually produce cash flow? And this is another metric of ours that that COVID completely messed with, because our average, just as we were going into COVID, was roughly 2 years that it would take us to get a startup into cash flow. But that number has obviously now been thrown out of whack completely as a result of COVID. We then seek to work with the founders and their founding teams to grow the portfolio companies. We call it the value addition side. We're essentially develop a value addition strategy, and we create work plans, and we check in with the portfolio companies on a weekly basis as to how it's going with them and how they're doing in terms of progress in relation to all the 150 items that need to be checked off on the work plan. And it's especially intense, resource intensive, from a people perspective, from a capital perspective in those first 18 to 24 months. We generally try to focus on things like governance, compliance, operating standards, internal controls, financial management controls, so that we can free up the team to really focus on business development and sales. And one of the main reasons for that is because once you put your equity capital into a startup, the clock starts ticking, and effectively, the faster you can get that startup to start producing cash flow, the faster you start making a return on your investment. And so that becomes a very important part for us. And then sort of around our average holding period, and we're now at 0.4 prepare. Our average holding period for the portfolio companies is roughly 5 to 7 years. This is generally for fund managers that are operating in Africa. This is pretty standard. And it's got a lot to do with just some of the jurisdictional dynamics that you have when you operate in Africa. You may have certain delays when it comes to getting licensing. You may come up against certain components of the bureaucracy in each of the jurisdictions that make it a little bit more cumbersome to get going. And so your holding period for the investment, the time that you take to actually prepare the investment for an exit sort of is increased. And so during this time, you're starting to identify the specific potential buyers for your investments. What we try to do is we always try to identify the type of exit for the portfolio company beforehand. So will it be a trade sale? Could it potentially be an IPO or an initial public offering? We try to do that beforehand, and in relation to a lot of other countries in Southern Africa, Namibia is in a very advantageous position because of its very close commercial and political relationship with South Africa. South Africa being the most industrialized economy in Africa, so this really helps us understand, and it makes it a little bit easier to sort of work through your universe of potential buyers if you're going to do a trade sale for a portfolio company. And so we start doing this, and then we get into actual exits. One or two of our portfolio companies are reasonably close to this, and we really like strategic buyers. It's just it's a more organic exit play for us in this part of the region, given the dynamics of the region and the economics of the various economies in the region. Our portfolio companies, we did 3 investments all along the payments value chain. So essentially, these companies, they either do electronic wallets, which are a store of value, a digital store of value, or they process payments, mostly card payments, for a retailer through the bank. And so this has been a really interesting space in Namibia because it's still reasonably fragmented, and there's obviously the relationship with the banking sector in Namibia. We have sort of 4 main commercial banks, 3 of which are South African banks with who have extensive branch networks in Namibia. So it's a really interesting and emerging space in Namibia, the electronic payment space. And then we did 5 manufacturing deals, and we invested in pharmaceuticals, animal feed, construction materials, and specifically those construction materials are drywall, as it's called in North America and Europe. Here we call them ceiling boards. And we also invested in an LED street light company. And then we did an industrial salt company, which is essentially making animal lick for both cattle and horses mainly, but also for our game farmers. And essentially in that business, what they do is they get the raw salt, coarse salt, and they put it in a 10-ton press, and they make these 20 kilogram and 10 kilogram salt blocks, which the farmers use for salt lick. And it's a fantastic little business because we've been able to secure quite a lot of interest from all over the world, actually, for its products. And they have about 23 products now with just different additives in the salt. So it could be anything from phosphorus to sulfur to alum. So the manufacturing is something we sort of happened upon. We sort of started looking at these high growth potentials that are aligned with the structure of the Namibian economy. And this is some of what we unearthed, and we were able to identify a few really promising entrepreneurs who were keen to start these businesses, and we eventually were able to invest in some of these reasonably high growth areas, not only for Namibia but for the region. Some of the ways that we mitigate the risks is we look at market size and regional growth prospects. We essentially, while we invest in a startup, by the time that they are in production or generating cash flows, they're a medium-sized business. I'll make the example of Namibia Gypsum Industries, which makes ceiling boards in a small town about 50 kilometers from the coast called Arandis. And NGI, as we call it, essentially, while it was a startup 3 years ago, when it's at full production, sort of at the end of the first quarter of 2022, NGI will be producing roughly 12 million square meters of ceiling boards per year, which means it's one of the largest producers of ceiling boards in the region. And so then we also look at the demand for the goods and services. One great way that we found to mitigate a lot of the risk is to have offtake agreements in place, and yeah, I don't necessarily mean like purchase orders or letters of intent or anything like that, but actual offtake agreements where the buyers commit to taking X amount of the production over X amount of time, and we found that that's a great way to support the businesses, not only with mitigating the risk of making the initial investment, but also later on, if you need sort of different kinds of financing, you can usually leverage the offtake agreement into some kind of working capital financing, which has been really useful for us. We like to look at security of supply. It's incredibly important to us. We like to vertically integrate these early stage businesses as quickly as possible. And so we like to make sure that there's adequate supply of whatever it is they're producing. A lot of this is aligned with Namibia's overall minerals beneficiation strategy that was developed by the Ministry of Mines and Energy. So on NGI, for example, for us it's really important that we try to see to what extent we can find gypsum rock so that NGI is able to ensure that it always has adequate supply of gypsum rock, which makes up 95% of a ceiling board. And then financing, we like to find co-investors. We were very fortunate with Growth Fund 1 to work with the Development Bank of Namibia on quite a few of our projects, where they came in after we invested the equity capital, and they provided all sorts of either facilities to procure plant and equipment, or they provided working capital, which has been incredibly useful for the portfolio company. And then, of course, whatever regulatory environmental incentives we can find, we try to leverage as well in the region, and especially through the different programs that exist in the Southern Africa Development Community, which is SADC, and also the Southern Africa Customs Union, which is SACU. We really take a hands-on approach to all our portfolio companies, which we found, I'd say, mitigates a lot of the additional risk that comes with execution. The biggest risk we always say is that we manage is execution risk, because we believe that it's actually the execution of the business plan that creates the most potential for things going awry. And so we really try to manage that execution risk very closely. On the one hand, by through the founders that we select to work with, and of course their teams. And then we try to support them as much as we can. And as you can see there in the customized value addition strategy in the work plan section, those are some of the things that we then do to support the portfolio company. And then some of the things that we try to make sure we have in place is some of the qualities which we think make a successful exit. Is that the company has a good reputation, that it's well managed by an experienced or qualified team, that it's very disciplined financially, and that it's got a scalable business model. All of the portfolio companies that we invested in are sort of regionally facing, so to speak. So they're anchored in the Namibian market, but they focus on the Southern Africa Development Community or Southern Africa. And the simple reason for that is because the Namibian economy is so small, which just means, and yet it's got fantastic infrastructure, which means it's a fantastic place to establish a business and actually prove concept if you need to do any sort of market testing and all those sorts of things. The community or the demographic makeup in Namibia is very similar to that in South Africa, so it's a fantastic place to test products or services. And then you can essentially, once you've proven concept, roll out to a larger market. Of our portfolio companies, 3 of them have offtake agreements with or strategic relationships with South African partners, for example. So I'd now like to turn to some of the impact that we've seen as a result of COVID on the companies in our portfolio, and also SMEs in Namibia in general, but also SMEs in Southern Africa. As we all know, there's been, and it's been extensively written about, there's been a massive impact on global supply chains and value chains. But what they've done, I think, for us in Africa is they've caused us to rethink our dependence on those global supply chains, because when you're at the back of the queue in a small open economy like Namibia, it really hits you the hardest. And so one of the things that I think a lot of policymakers and decision makers and business leaders have woken up to is that the dependence creates vulnerabilities. And so we sort of need to fix those vulnerabilities in various areas. It's about risk management. It's about the availability of those opportunities and also the means to take advantage of those opportunities. And it's also about efficiency. We've seen and cost. We've seen with some of our portfolio companies, for example, just in talking to their clients, one of the biggest reasons they've turned to, like, I'll make the example of NGI. One of the biggest reasons that we have a partner that sits in South Africa who is now buying from ceiling boards from NGI is because they normally would either order from the Middle East or Asia. But in doing so, it takes the goods or the ceiling boards to arrive. It takes it about 6 to 8 weeks for the ceiling boards to arrive. They have to get organize some sort of trade facility with their bank, which has additional cost. And then they're almost always over ordering, which means once the goods arrive with them, then they've got all sorts of storage problems and there are costs associated with that. But ordering from NGI, they can get a truckload or truckloads of ceiling boards to them within 2 to 3 days. And so that's incredibly efficient and cost effective for them and supports their margins. And so I think what COVID has done is it's created this idea that we need to accelerate the extent to which we trade regionally, and especially because of the costs associated and the risks associated and how all of this makes us so vulnerable. And of course, COVID's created a lot of opportunities. Now, it's not always easy for these SMEs to take advantage of these opportunities because they don't necessarily have the balance sheets. But a lot of industries are being remade. You know, we're now seeing the massive shift towards digitization in healthcare. We're of course, because COVID left us all understanding just how we were caught napping. There's been massive investments in biotech. Education is being remade or being rethought. Video streaming services have blown up, and so a lot of those opportunities are also prevalent in Southern Africa, and more so in many instances because of the acceleration as a result of COVID to move to digitize more and to move online more. That we expect will have a positive impact on Southern Africa in the long term. There are obviously other opportunities for businesses, the opportunities to reduce operating costs. We've seen, and a lot has been written about how many companies don't expect to even go back to hiring as many staff on site, which just means they've reduced rent expenses, they've reduced HR or human resource related costs, they've reduced travel costs and associated costs, they've reduced time. And many companies now, because we're almost 2 years in to working within the realities or the constraints of the pandemic, many companies have figured out how they, if they were not productive at the onset, how they can be productive now while working in a safe way. And then, of course, one of the other big impacts that we've seen is with financing. You know, traditional options aren't the most appropriate anymore. We see a lot of SMEs in Namibia who have largely been dependent on some kind of debt or credit financing are turning away from that for the simple reason that while interest rates are low and the debt repayment costs are low, there's no assurance or certainty around sales, around revenues, because so many people have lost their jobs and, well, the recovery is still ongoing. And so it's interesting that more and more other types of small business financing opportunities are now presenting themselves. One of those, for example, is working capital financing, or in some parts of the world, it's called accounts receivable financing. Another one that's becoming more popular is factoring, where essentially you are able to leverage the invoices that you have from customers. And so a lot of those are becoming a lot more prominent, and a lot of SME owners are turning to those as opposed to the traditional forms of financing. And it's going to be interesting to see what that looks like and how the traditional financiers of those products like debt and credit, being the banks mostly in Southern Africa, how they respond and how they change some of their products for these small and medium-sized businesses. Another thing that's changed and where we will see ongoing changes is in litigation and regulation. Flow of goods was obviously hampered during all of the lockdowns, but there seems to be a lot, and especially in a part of the world like ours, where flow of goods hasn't always been that easy, and so it seems to be getting some more energy to improve the efficiency with which goods can flow across borders. We have a fantastic example about the Namibia-Zambia border, which was it was a really difficult border for a really long time, and with long wait times for both people and goods. And part of it was because of the way that we used to cross. It was like essentially single lane. But they built this fantastic bridge, which opened last year, and now goods and people are able to flow much faster through the border. And at the same time, as a bridge opening, the Namibian customs officials worked with their Zambian counterparts, and they were able to improve the flow of goods at the systems level. So now you only have to stop on one side, doesn't matter which direction you're coming from, which really helps the time spent at the border, especially for imports or exports. I thought I'd put this map in there because it shows all of these wonderful trade routes, mostly out of Namibia into Southern Africa, and the ones in the ocean are obviously the shipping lines, and then you see the train routes, the blue dotted lines, and you see the solid blue lines there are your roads, which essentially take goods and people from Namibia into the region. And a lot of this is so essential for rethinking the extent to which we can harness the power of regional value chains and regional trade. One of the most important sort of features of Southern Africa is the fact that you've got South Africa, which is the most industrialized country in Africa, right at the tip, surrounded by all these consumption economies, which macroeconomically look very similar, and interestingly, they all run a trade deficit with respect to South Africa. And so it's really interesting what would happen if you started greater intra-trade in the intra-regional trade in Southern Africa, because what you would see is that these countries would start balancing their economy, and some of those macroeconomic issues that have and continue to plague them would start falling away. And here we're talking about high inflation, high interest rates, volatile currencies, high and increasing public debt. And so for us, that's the kind of change we would like to see in the region, and that's the kind of change we'd like to be part of. Some of the ways that COVID affected operations for SMEs is, it created massive shutdowns, which had a great effect on the companies themselves. We have a case of one portfolio company where they had roughly just under 2 million Namibia dollars or rand equivalent of sales orders, and those were cancelled within 2 days. And there are many other stories like that, and the same with the suppliers. And so shutdowns were big, and while the shutdowns had a massive impact on the company, they also had a massive impact, especially on employees. In Namibia, you've got reasonably, especially high unemployment rates, north of 40%, and a lot of the employees are generally quite impoverished. They live from month to month. So you can imagine the kind of impact that a shutdown and the inability to get an income or to get your full income had on some of those workers. A lot of our portfolio companies had to, or the ones that are in operation, and yeah, I'm especially thinking about the services ones, those fintech companies, they had to give discounts to customers because one of them, innovation, provides card processing facilities to retailers, but because the retailers didn't get the same amount of foot traffic, they weren't making the same amount of sales, which just meant they asked innovation eventually for a discount on what they were paying them per month for those processing services. Arrangements with creditors. Fortunately, in Namibia, most of the creditors banded together, and especially the financial creditors, who gave grace periods and repayment holidays, and so in that sense, they really supported the businesses. Of course, sometimes those repayment holidays need to be extended again, and the reason for that is because the recovery just hasn't happened as fast as everybody thought. On top of that, the Namibian economy was in recession from about 2016, 2017 already, prior to COVID, which just means that the depth of the hole that the Namibian economy has to climb out of is significant. Very oftentimes, debt or equity was used to finance operations and working capital, which just now means new financing facilities have to be sought for us, especially to try to get some of those portfolio companies back into production and into cash flow. And this is true for a lot of SMEs. More of the impact is that, employment has still not recovered to pre-COVID levels. It likely won't in the short term. We expect that that'll take at least 2 to 3 years for some of that to come back to the way it was. And part of the reason for that is because A, it's the economic recovery, but B, it's also businesses are finding new ways to do things and have realized how they can change the way they were doing things before, and as a result, may not go back to full employment. And so that's been quite an impact, and in Namibia especially so because we've got such high unemployment rates. Some industries may never be the same again. In Namibia, our tourism sector has started recovering slowly. We're really excited about that. We're seeing foreign tourists arriving again, visiting our lodges, renting cars to do self-drive tours, and all of that is extremely exciting. We don't know what it will look like in the long term because some of them have had to shut down. A lot of the companies in the tourism space, so we don't actually know where they can be brought back. And then, of course, restaurants, airlines, some of these may never be the same again. Remote work and training, office workers are starting to become an endangered species. We are seeing, even pre-COVID, we started seeing a hollowing out of the downtown area in Namibia's capital city, Windhoek, where a lot of big businesses were starting to move out of the city center. That has only been accelerated by COVID. We're seeing obviously increases in vacancy rates. Some of the big property owning companies are really struggling with that, and will continue to do so in the short to medium term, just because of the changing nature of work. And one of the other things that we're obviously seeing globally, but also again in a microcosm that is Namibia or Southern Africa, is remuneration, benefits, and costs. Some of these are now being passed on to workers, where companies are sort of trying to not be responsible for those costs, especially because they can now have seen the opportunity or the extent to which they can actually reduce those expenses. And then, of course, financing. The fact that traditional financing options aren't necessarily as relevant anymore. and also that companies just aren't turning to them as readily anymore, which just means a rethink and a change in the kinds of products that are being made available to small businesses. I wanted to put this in here because it's the J curve for the Baobab Growth Fund 1. And you know, what we did initially, and we did this exercise in 2020. And what we did was we tried to forecast where we were in terms of the J curve and where we would likely end up given our expected growth rates for the portfolio companies and the portfolio as a whole. And so you'll see the top line there, the orange one is our pre-COVID forecast, you know, what we did sort of late 2019, early 2020. And then the black line below it is where we expect it to be now. And we're not 100% certain that it will look like that, but just because some of the data is still sort of feeding through the system and we don't have it all ready yet, so that we can create a new baseline and project from there. But that's what we're expecting it to look like, which is less a J and more almost a slanted line. And this is just to show you some of the impact that we've seen as a result of COVID on our portfolio. I thought I'd show you this little video just to show how a lot of people in Namibia are returning, I should say, to the tried and trusted, as opposed to the new and the technologically advanced.
Actually, awful.
I won't repeat what he said, but this is one of my favorite little videos that was sort of shot during this pandemic era, and it had to do with this Land Cruiser getting stuck in the while trying to cross a river. And I don't know if you know much about Land Cruisers, but they're a revered mode of transport in some of the harsher parts in Africa. And so seeing the donkey cart do what it did, going past a Land Cruiser like that, is to me just such symbolism of how we had to go back to more of the simplicity and more of the things that we know to work, and that we can't always necessarily depend on most technologically advanced solutions. Despite COVID impact, we're still very focused on the fundamentals, and we believe that some of these fundamentals will also be the way out of this this pandemic and the crisis and the economic crisis that it brought with it. Again, just to reiterate, Southern Africa is essentially mostly consumption economies, with South Africa, which is the most industrialized country in Africa, at its tip, which just means that there are all of these new opportunities, or essentially that the opportunities have been accelerated, and the extent of taking advantage of those opportunities have been accelerated. So, for example, food and medicines, the need and the associated risks with not having those or producing those in country became really acute during COVID. Namibia had massive medicine shortages, and Namibia isn't alone in this region. Some of the other countries in the region had similar issues. The other issue that we had was food shortages. You know, Namibia imports anywhere between 70 to 80% of fresh food from South Africa, and it's trucked into the country, which just leaves us incredibly vulnerable if the borders are closed, which it was during COVID. And so what's interesting is over the last 18 months, you sort of notice more and more, especially on the fresh food side, where there are more and more suppliers in the grocery stores who are locally based or based in Namibia, which is incredibly encouraging for the future, because that's more of what we need, especially on the food and medicine side. Again, just to reiterate, those regional value chains are more important than ever. And Namibia, it's especially important that the economy provides the solution. And believe me, I'm not one of those folks that believe that the market is the only solution. I believe that we need mutually beneficial relationships, and that there is a place for government involvement in the economy. But Namibia is in a very unique situation where its government has been since 2017 in fiscal crisis, and that has only gotten worse as a result of COVID. And so as a result of the high public debt rates, you essentially need the economy to be the driving force around the recovery, and for government to create that enabling environment. Resilience, I thought I'd put this in here because resilience is such an important factor in success, and there's some really good books out now that sort of are debunking the talent myth over things like grit. Here I'm thinking about Angela Duckworth's book entitled Grit. And we have a lot of resilience in Africa generally, and in Southern Africa as well. There's a lot of resilience. The problem is, you wonder with a black swan event like the coronavirus outbreak, to what extent that resilience is tested. And the longer it goes, the more it reduces the resilience factor in people. And so, of course, we've seen these impoverished workers that I mentioned earlier, who are generally impoverished and live month to month on their salaries as it is. A lot of these workers have been unemployed, and a lot of these workers have seen have seen job losses, and a lot of these workers have seen reductions in their incomes. And in our part of the world, there's a great role to be played by public and private capital to support the economic growth that is already wanting to happen. The human spirit, I believe, is one of resilience, and is one of entrepreneurship, and it's one of trying to make a situation better and trying to self-actualize. But we need some of these public and private sources of capital that can be catalysts to some of that spirit, and in partnership support how we get out of the impact that these economies have been dealt as a result of COVID. What we are seeing now in Namibia as well is Namibia is very vulnerable to climate change, and climate change has started to impact the recovery. As I mentioned before, Namibia has been in sort of a recession since 2017, and that's only been exacerbated by variable rainfall and the extent to which underground water is, of which Namibia has a lot, but when rainfall is variable, then those sort of sources of underground water starts being depleted. And so climate change is starting to really show that how important it is that we are able to finance and support Namibia's adaptability to climate change. And We think climate change will probably have a significant impact on Namibia over the next few years, and will make the recovery much harder. There is a drive for greater economic independence. You see that with so many Southern African countries, and it's way more. It was especially acute during the pandemic, as people realized just exactly how vulnerable they are. And so you are seeing policymakers and decision makers starting to come to terms with the reality that we can't keep going as we have been. Something drastic needs to change. And then, of course, people are making different decisions around financing. Again, I think this is part of the move to simplicity and part of the understanding of just how vulnerable we are. And I think as a result, everyone is sort of taking different and sometimes better decisions for themselves and for their businesses. We think some of the environmental, social, and social governance areas are great ways for SMEs to support their recovery, because we've seen how it can enhance returns. We've seen this with some of our portfolio companies. It fits a long-term sustainable growth approach. And what we have done as Baobab Capital is we're signatory to the UN's Principles for Responsible Investment. And we use that to integrate environmental and social governance principles into the portfolio companies. And so some of the outcomes we evaluate is the social and environmental outcomes, the impact on the financials of the portfolio companies, impact on sustainability, and supporting the team to build their own capacity as it relates to ESG. And then we use a few evaluation tools. These include the UNPRI's impact indicators, their reporting guidelines, and we also use the UN's Sustainable Development Goal targets. I want to end off by just showing you this little video about ecosystems.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes. And as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was a soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
For more information about what we do and if you wanted to get in touch, if you had any questions about this presentation, please contact me at the email address on the screen, or just go to our website. And thank you very much.